It is impossible to approach an aircraft carrier unnoticed. This is what everyone believed. This is how officers were trained. This is how calculations were built and how the entire logic of naval warfare was structured. An aircraft carrier is never alone. Escort ships are always around it. Destroyers and cruisers block every direction and form a protective ring. Above the sea, anti-submarine aircraft operate constantly. Beneath the surface, listening and surveillance systems are deployed that detect any suspicious movement. This system was supposed to see everything. The American concept of naval superiority was built on a simple certainty. If an enemy submarine attempted to get closer, it would be detected in advance. Not at the last moment and not by chance, but long before it could reach a dangerous distance. It was believed that the ocean was under control and that underwater stealth was no longer possible. This confidence seemed unquestionable. It was reinforced by exercises reports and decades of practice. A United States aircraft carrier strike group was perceived as the most protected military object in the world, a symbol of control over the ocean and proof of technological superiority. But during the Cold War, an episode occurred that destroyed this rule. A Soviet nuclear submarine quietly passed through the multi-layered defense of NATO and ended up where it could not exist in principle. Not on the edge of the search area, and not at a distance, but inside a zone where the enemy was confident of complete safety. The most disturbing conclusion was not that the submarine managed to get close. The most frightening part was something else. All systems were functioning normally. The calculations matched. The reports sounded confident. But reality no longer corresponded to these data. At that moment, it became clear that the American concept of naval superiority could be blind. And this realization turned out to be far more dangerous than any attack. The Cold War almost never looks like a war. There are no explosions and no fire. There are no captured cities and no front lines. Instead, there is constant confrontation in silence, where each side tries to understand how well it can see the enemy and how well the enemy can see it. Victory here is measured not by destruction, but by information and confidence. For the United States, control over the ocean was the foundation of its entire military strategy. Aircraft carrier strike groups were considered the main instrument of power. They made it possible to project influence onto any coastline and operate independently of Allied bases. But this power had one critical condition. The aircraft carrier had to remain unreachable for underwater threats. That is why a complex system of anti-submarine defense was built around aircraft carriers. Escort ships, anti-submarine aviation, and stationary listening systems worked as a single organism. It was believed that if a Soviet submarine approached, it would be detected long before it could pose any danger. This confidence lay at the core of all calculations and plans. The Soviet Union saw this picture differently. In Moscow, it was well understood that in the event of a real conflict, submarines would become one of the few tools capable of balancing the forces. But for this, it was necessary to answer a key question. How reliable was the NATO detection system in reality, and where were its true limits? This is why Soviet submarines regularly went out into the ocean, not for attack and not for a show of force. Their task was far more dangerous: to test reality, to test whether it was possible to get closer than American calculations allowed, to test what would happen if a submarine behaved not as expected. During one of these deployments, a Soviet nuclear submarine received a mission that seemed almost impossible. In the Atlantic Ocean, an aircraft carrier strike group of the United States Navy was operating. The task was to secretly enter its area of operations, remain there as long as possible, and attempt to reach a position for a simulated attack. This was not a test of the crew's skill. It was a test of the entire concept of control over the ocean. If the submarine was detected, then the system worked as intended. If not, the consequences would be far more serious than a successful exercise. In that case, it would become clear that the most expensive and technologically advanced military construct could have blind spots. The submarine crew understood the risk. Any mistake could lead to detection and the immediate end of the operation. But even more dangerous was the possible result. If the submarine could remain near the aircraft carrier group unnoticed, it would mean that ideas about security and superiority required revision. At that moment, no one yet knew how this mission would end. For the American side, it was another stage of exercises and confirmation of familiar calculations. For the Soviet submarine, it was an attempt to look beyond the boundary of illusion, an attempt to understand what lay behind the enemy's confidence and how strong it truly was. A Soviet nuclear submarine begins its movement into an area where a United States aircraft carrier strike group is operating. This section of the ocean is considered one of the most tightly controlled. Data from stationary listening systems converge here, along with the routes of anti-submarine aviation and patrols by escort ships. According to all calculations, covert penetration into this area is impossible. NATO command is confident that any underwater activity will be detected long before a dangerous approach. That is why the aircraft carrier group continues to operate calmly and without additional precautionary measures. The system confirms itself and does not issue any alarms. The sea appears clean. The Soviet submarine acts differently than the enemy expects. It does not seek to reduce the distance directly and does not attempt to cross search zones along the shortest route. Instead, the crew uses the characteristics of the ocean environment. Deep layers of water differ in temperature and density, and these differences distort the propagation of sound. Where acoustic calculations assume confident detection, a zone of uncertainty emerges. The submarine descends below calculated depths. Its movement becomes slow and extremely cautious. Every maneuver is performed with consideration of the ocean's acoustic background. The submarine does not attempt to become completely invisible. It becomes uninteresting to a system that is looking for different behavior and different signs of threat. At the same time, the aircraft carrier strike group continues to move along its planned route. Escort ships block directions that are considered the most likely for submarine penetration. Anti-submarine aircraft drop buoys according to standard patterns and receive the expected data. There are no contacts, and this confirms the confidence that the area is safe. Gradually, the Soviet submarine reduces the distance. It enters a space where the enemy is confident of complete control. None of the systems register its presence because the submarine does not violate the patterns on which the entire logic of the search is built. It is located where, according to calculations, there should be nothing. It is at this moment that it becomes clear the operation goes beyond a routine exercise. The Soviet submarine is not merely avoiding detection. It finds itself inside a multi-layered defense and remains unnoticed. This means that the very concept of anti-submarine control has limits that were previously considered theoretical. For the submarine crew, this is only the beginning. The main task lies ahead. Not merely to penetrate the defense, but to prove that presence can be maintained for a long period without detection. If this succeeds, the consequences will be far more serious than a temporary success in the ocean. The absence of contacts is perceived by NATO command as confirmation that the calculations are correct. All data aligns. Stationary listening systems do not register underwater activity. Anti-submarine aircraft return from their sorties without alarm signals. Escort ships continue to move according to established patterns. In the headquarters, the conclusion is drawn that the area is fully under control. It is at this moment that a decision is made which will later be called a key mistake. The search is not intensified, but optimized. Part of the resources are reassigned to other areas. Aircraft receive new tasks. Buoys are deployed less frequently and in a more dispersed pattern. This appears to be a logical step because the system sees no threat and does not demand additional effort. The Soviet submarine continues to move within the protective screen. The crew notes a change in enemy activity. From the character of noises and maneuvers, it becomes clear that the density of the search is decreasing. This confirms the main conclusion of the operation. The enemy fully trusts its models and makes decisions not based on reality, but on what the system displays. Now the submarine gains the ability to act more freely. It does not increase speed and does not make sharp maneuvers. Its task is not to exploit the mistake, but to allow it to fully reveal itself. The longer the submarine remains unnoticed, the more obvious the failure of anti-submarine defense logic becomes. During this period, the crew begins stable tracking of the aircraft carrier strike group. The submarine maintains a safe distance and follows on a parallel course. All parameters of the target's movement become known. Speed maneuver patterns and reactions to changes in the situation are recorded without interference. The American side does not notice what is happening. For it, the situation appears stable and predictable. The absence of contacts is perceived as proof that the threat was eliminated at distant approaches. No one allows the thought that a submarine could be inside the protective screen and conduct observation for an extended period. At this moment, the operation ceases to be a test of penetration capability. It turns into an experiment on the control system itself. The Soviet submarine is not hiding from the search. It exists outside the logic of that search, and it is precisely this that allows it to remain invisible. Every minute of such tracking amplifies the effect. This is no longer an accident, and not a fortunate coincidence. It is confirmation that anti-submarine defense can be bypassed not through superiority in force, but through understanding its internal assumptions. Ahead lies the most dangerous stage. Any attempt by NATO to regain control could lead to a sharp increase in risk. But if even this stage does not result in detection, then the conclusions will be inevitable and extremely unpleasant for those who built the entire system of ocean control. After some time, the first doubts begin to appear in NATO headquarters. They are not formalized as an alarm and are not accompanied by system signals. It is more a sense that the picture is too calm. In the area where the aircraft carrier strike group is operating, nothing unusual is happening. But this very calmness begins to raise questions among some analysts. A decision is made to conduct an additional check of the area, not because a threat has been detected, but because it is necessary to confirm control. Anti-submarine aviation returns to the air. Escort ships receive instructions to change routes and more tightly sweep specific sectors. According to the command's intent, this should either reveal a submarine or finally confirm its absence. The Soviet submarine detects the change in the situation almost immediately. From the character of the noises, it becomes clear that the search has resumed. Aircraft return to the area. Buoys appear in the water again. For the crew, this is the most dangerous moment of the entire operation. Now, any mistake can lead to detection and the immediate end of the mission. The commander makes the decision not to withdraw. Withdrawal would mean the loss of the main proof. The submarine remains at the same depths and maintains minimal speed. Its behavior stays the same as it was during the previous hours. This is a risky step because enemy activity is increasing, but it is precisely the stability of behavior that allows the submarine not to stand out against the background of ocean noise. NATO search actions intensify but remain within the same logic as before. Aircraft sweep sectors that are considered the most likely for the appearance of a submarine. Escort ships shift according to standard patterns. The system searches for the target where, according to calculations, it should be and not where it already is. At a certain moment, the distance between the Soviet submarine and one of the escort ships decreases to a dangerous level. Noises become more distinct. Any maneuver could lead to the crossing of acoustic traces. The crew freezes, waiting for the enemy's reaction, but it does not come. The ship passes by without registering the presence of the submarine. This episode becomes a turning point. It shows that even with intensified search, the system is unable to go beyond its own assumptions. The attempt to restore control does not lead to detection, but only confirms the blindness of the existing model. The Soviet submarine remains inside the protective screen and continues to track the aircraft carrier group. Now it becomes clear that the operation has moved to a new level. This is no longer a test of detection boundaries. It is a demonstration that even active measures do not guarantee the return of control. And if the submarine can continue to hold this position, the consequences for the opponent will be inevitable. Enemy activity continues to grow. The search no longer looks routine. Escort ships change their movement order and begin to close distances. Aircraft stay airborne longer and return more frequently. Tension appears in the acoustic picture that cannot be ignored. For the submarine crew, it becomes obvious that the enemy is trying to restore the lost sense of control. NATO command does not know where to search for the submarine, but understands that its previous confidence has cracked. Measures are therefore taken that are meant to cover all possible options. Search sectors begin to overlap. Ship movements become less predictable. Calculations are performed at an accelerated pace. This creates the feeling that detection is inevitable. The Soviet submarine finds itself in a position where any wrong decision can lead to contact. Maneuvers are reduced to a minimum. Depth is maintained within an acoustic shadow. The crew works at the limit of concentration. Any sound, any deviation from the background can be perceived as a sign of a target. At one moment, the situation becomes critical. One of the escort ships passes at a dangerously close distance. Its noise overwhelms the background of the ocean. The acoustic environment changes instantly. On board the submarine, a silence sets in where only the operation of machinery can be heard. Any movement now could be noticed. The escort ship begins a maneuver. Its course changes as if it is attempting to clarify a contact. Several minutes stretch endlessly. For the crew, this is the point after which the operation will either end immediately or move into its decisive phase. But the contact is not confirmed. The ship moves away, continuing its search in another sector. This moment becomes a turning point. It shows that even under maximum tension, the enemy is unable to go beyond its own search model. The system operates at the limit, but continues to look for the submarine where it should be, not where it actually is. This creates the illusion of activity without a real result. After this episode, it becomes clear that further tracking is possible. The risk remains high, but the probability of detection decreases with every minute. The enemy exhausts its ability to intensify the search without receiving confirmation of a threat. The Soviet submarine maintains its position and continues to observe the aircraft carrier strike group. Now the operation approaches its logical conclusion. It remains to prove the main point, that the submarine did not merely manage to penetrate and survive, but reached a position where the outcome of a hypothetical engagement would have been predetermined. It is this realization that will become the moment after which returning to previous confidence will no longer be possible. As the tension gradually subsides, it becomes clear that the most dangerous phase is over. The enemy has taken every measure allowed by the existing search logic and has achieved no result. Activity begins to decrease not because of renewed confidence, but because of a lack of new solutions. The system has exhausted itself and no longer knows what to do next. The Soviet submarine continues to track the aircraft carrier strike group. Now this is no longer a risky experiment, but deliberate observation. The crew establishes a stable position relative to the target. The distance allows continuous control and preserves the conditions for a simulated attack. All parameters confirm the main conclusion: the submarine is where it should not be and yet remains unnoticed. At this moment, a calculation of a hypothetical strike is conducted. Not for the use of weapons, but to fix the result of the operation. Taking into account speed course and relative positions, it becomes obvious that in a real combat situation, the aircraft carrier would have had no time to respond. The decision would have been made too late. The window for defense would have been closed before the threat was even realized. What matters is not that an attack is possible. What matters is that it is possible without prior detection. All key elements of the American concept of naval superiority assumed early warning. It was supposed to provide time for maneuver and protection. But in this situation, that time does not exist. The Soviet submarine holds its position for as long as the mission allows. Tracking continues under conditions in which the enemy is confident that no threat exists. For the crew, it becomes absolutely clear that the operation has achieved its goal. Proof has been obtained not in words and not in reports, but in the real conditions of the ocean. After leaving the area and completing the operation, the results are recorded and analyzed. They now exist not as an assumption, but as a fact. The submarine managed to pass unnoticed through NATO defenses, reach an attack position, and remain there for an extended period. This means that the system of ocean control has a fundamental vulnerability. For the American side, realization comes later. Not during the exercises and not in the course of the search, but after data analysis, when it becomes clear that the submarine was near the aircraft carrier group and could operate without interference. It is then that a shock emerges that cannot be ignored. At this stage, it becomes clear that the operation is complete. Not because resources have been exhausted or a threat of detection has arisen, but because the main conclusion can no longer be reversed. The American concept of naval superiority proved to be blind at the very moment it was confident in absolute control. The real consequences of this operation do not appear immediately. During the exercises themselves, everything looks routine for the American side. There are no contacts. The system has functioned as expected. The area is considered safe. The aircraft carrier strike group completes its maneuvers without incident. On the surface, there's not a single sign that anything outside normal practice has occurred. True realization comes later when data analysis begins. Analysts compare the movement routes of the aircraft carrier group, the acoustic environment, and the reports of anti-submarine forces. Gradually, a picture emerges that cannot be explained by familiar logic. During certain periods, control over the area was absent, despite the fact that all elements of the system were functioning properly. It becomes clear that the Soviet submarine remained within the operational zone of the aircraft carrier group for a significantly longer time than calculations allowed. Moreover, the analysis shows that the submarine could reach an attack position without prior detection. This contradicts the basic assumptions on which the entire concept of anti-submarine defense was built. Tension arises in the headquarters. The problem is not a single specific mistake and not a failure of equipment. All systems worked exactly as they were designed. This is precisely what makes the situation dangerous. It becomes evident that the very model of ocean control has limitations that were previously considered theoretical and insignificant. The reaction of the United States is predictable. The search for solutions begins. Patrols are intensified. The number of anti-submarine aircraft increases. Buoy deployment zones are expanded. But quite quickly, it becomes clear that simply increasing effort does not eliminate the problem. The system continues to search for submarines within the framework of previous expectations. At the same time, a reassessment of approaches to underwater warfare begins. The need arises to take into account the influence of the ocean environment, deep layers, and acoustic shadows. Interest grows in new types of sensors and in detection methods that do not rely on standard acoustic patterns. This means that the former confidence in the transparency of the ocean no longer works. For NATO, this episode becomes a painful signal. It shows that the opponent is capable of acting outside the boundaries of expected behavior. That a submarine can not only penetrate, but also remain near key objects for a long time without being detected. This undermines trust in existing doctrines and forces recognition of the vulnerability of what was considered an absolute advantage. The most important consequence is a change in mindset. For the first time, there is an understanding that control over the ocean is not guaranteed, that even the most complex and expensive system can be blind if reality goes beyond the limits of its model. This realization is not publicly advertised, but it begins to influence the decisions that will be made in the years to come. By this point, it becomes clear that what happened was not an episode and not an exception. It was a signal of the beginning of a new phase of underwater confrontation where victory would be determined not by the quantity of equipment, but by the ability to see what previously remained unseen. The true significance of this episode did not become clear immediately. It was not accompanied by explosions, and it did not appear in newspaper headlines. There were no public statements and no loud acknowledgments, but in classified reports and analytical briefings, it left a mark that could not be ignored. A Soviet submarine did what was considered impossible, and in doing so, changed the very understanding of security at sea. The main consequence was not a specific operation, but the fact that it revealed the limits of control. The aircraft carrier remained a symbol of power, but it was no longer a symbol of absolute protection. It became clear that even the most complex system may fail to see a threat if that threat operates outside familiar patterns. This realization proved far more dangerous than any simulated attack. After this episode, underwater warfare could no longer remain the same. A reassessment of doctrines, approaches, and priorities began. Greater attention was given to stealth rather than detection alone. There emerged an understanding that technological superiority does not guarantee control if the opponent understands how to exploit weaknesses in the very logic of the system. For the United States, this became a painful lesson. For the Soviet Union, it was confirmation that an asymmetric approach could balance forces even in confrontation with a more powerful opponent. But the most important point lay elsewhere. The world was entering a phase where the decisive factor was not the quantity of weapons, but the ability to see reality as it truly is. Today, when submarines once again roam the oceans and technologies grow ever more complex, this lesson remains relevant. History shows that confidence can be more dangerous than ignorance, and that the most serious defeats sometimes occur not in battle, but at the moment when everything seems to be under control. If you are interested in stories like this about the hidden side of military conflicts and moments when the familiar picture of the world collapses, subscribe to the Secret Front channel. Here we tell stories that remained in the shadows for a long time and changed the course of history without loud declarations. Your subscription will help you not miss new interesting videos and support a project that brings forgotten pages of the past back to light. Thank you for watching this episode to the end. Stories like this deserve to be remembered.